This Sunday at 5:30 p.m., join us for a powerful conversation on Black and Golden. Hosted by acclaimed journalist and author Wayne Dawkins, we're diving deep into the legacy and impact of the National Association of Black Journalists, the organization that has shaped generations of storytellers and truth-tellers. Our special guests, media trailblazers George L. Daniels and Dan Holley, bringing insight, history, and firsthand experience from inside the movement. If you care about journalism, culture, and the power of our voice, this episode is for you. We're streaming Sunday, February 15th at 5:30 p.m. on YouTube at Urban Byte Network. Don't miss it. Click, watch, share. This is Black and Golden.
Good evening. I think of National Association of Black Journalist Conventions as movable feasts involving 3,000 to 4,000 people. So let's take last summer at NABJ Cleveland. There was a luncheon, and the sponsors were Chase Manhattan Bank, who provided a number of experts to give us tips about avoiding online and social media fraud. It also included a dear colleague, Michelle Singletary, who writes a finance column for the Washington Post, and she's made a career of explaining finance in easily customer-friendly terms. As far as politics, I immediately think of the Chicago convention the previous year, 2024. We members had a family feud because we invited presidential candidate Donald Trump to the convention. And we had a family feud because this was the first ever convicted felon U.S. president was now at our convention because he was running again for president. Well, journalism values made us realize we had to invite him because we have to hold people of power to account and scrutinize them, which we did. And so much so, if there were anyone who did not know about NABJ, they sure did now, because that spectacle went around the world several times and was communicated in multiple languages from anchor desks on every continent. So for this, I say this to welcome you to the second NABJ Black and Golden Forum. And this forum is based on the book that was published in December on the 50th anniversary of the founding of the National Association of Black Journalists. And you can get the book on Amazon.com or at augustpress.biz. So I'm the editor of the book and author, but I also had 9 wonderful co-writers, and 2 of them are joining us today. So joining us are George L. Daniels, who will talk about business journalism, and Dan Holley, who will talk about political writing and foreign correspondence. So welcome, gents. Good seeing you.
Great to be here.
Okay, so let's get into it. So I'll start with you, George. So why don't you talk about some of the people who got the whole business thing started? So there was Joe Boyce, who was a pioneer in many ways. Yes. And then following him, there was James Ellis and Rodney Brooks, who had key roles in getting this task force, a business journalist task force was formed. So can you kind of walk us through that? What happened?
Well, Wayne, I think it's important, first of all, to say thank you for inviting me and Dan to join you today. Uh, NABJ is so much more than just the convention that happens every summer. And I think it's important to establish as we have this conversation today that the organization that's now in its 51st year has meant a lot to many people who never come to the convention in the summer, but they are supported in their work as journalists. And that journalism doesn't just involve newspapers, it involves broadcast outlets, it involves online outlets. That NABJ family has a big tent. And I think that's important to establish as we start talking about our individual chapters. When it comes to the business journalism topic, the stories that I was trying to convey in that chapter, it was all about helping the readers to see the value in having a caucus of people who are telling stories about the business side of local communities, the business side of news organizations, the business of NABJ even. And how you define business might be in terms of personal finance, or it could be in terms of helping people to figure out what kind of jobs are available that don't involve stories on crime or stories on entertainment. All of that falls under that larger umbrella. And so one of the things we were trying to do with that chapter was to capture the progression of how NABJ has defined business when it comes to the task force. That, yes, you mentioned Rodney Brooks. The stories like his could be about starting at a local newspaper and being the only person covering business and covering it on a regular basis, and happening to be African American. But it also could be helping to mentor other Black journalists who are in the same situation in other newsrooms. Much later in the development of the task force, you have the stories of young people who are starting out at major organizations like the Wall Street Journal, like the New York Times, and they're covering business. And they're trying to organize people at the same time as they are managing the day-to-days of covering business. So those stories are different, and it is the diversity of those stories that we tried to capture in that chapter.
Yes. And are companies, or particularly media companies, but other kinds of companies, are they making a concerted effort to recruit journalists of color? I know one part of the book you noted that you have to get many members to understand you don't have to be an accountant to be a good business journalist.
That's correct. That's correct.
Could you speak to that a bit?
You have to look at the timeline and the organizations that were involved in doing the recruiting. In some cases, it was a local newspaper in its business section. Well, nowadays, a lot of local newspapers don't have dedicated business pages. In the 80s or the 90s, you would have those business pages. But now you have a USA Today, where I think Rodney was for a while. You have an organization like the American Society of News Editors, as it ended, as that was the name of it when it ended a few years ago, that was monitoring the diversity of its newspaper newsrooms. But now we don't have a metric like that. So the recruiting is still happening, but we don't have the data that we used to have to show that there is a whole lot going on an annual basis. And instead, you have some surveys, which we included in the chapter, that were really done, and a little bit of secondary analysis on the respondents in the survey to show, well, were they people of color or not people of color? So that is definitely a negative, but it is also a product of the current political environment, which we can't dismiss as this book came out. in the first year of an administration with a very different mindset about diversity, equity, inclusion.
Okay. I don't know if any of you have taken advantage of this, but one of the highlights is if you're willing to get up early in the morning on one of those convention days and get to the ballroom at 7:30, they'll have a full breakfast for you. And the business task force does a personal finance session. And that's one of the most valuable events. I know that's probably one of the few things that my wife and I make a point of getting up and going to, because we're hearing things about everything from how to pay your children's college expenses without bankrupting yourself, all the student loans to, you know,
Well, I think
building. For instance, I referenced Michelle Singletary. She gives very practical advice on how to build generational wealth, because for many Black families that they were not taught that. Some of us might be the first homeowners in our families. So there are those kinds of practical things. Rodney is very colorful about that. In fact, he had a chapter in a business book about how to be a 401k millionaire. It isn't as hard as you think. You just put a little bit here and a little bit there early in your career. But who are some of the other people? Because you talked to a number of sources. Who are some of the other people, and what are some of the things that they do in the business sphere?
I think Joseph Boyce is also important to mention. He was at the Wall Street Journal, and he was very instrumental in his time in making sure that special sections were done at the Wall Street Journal that addressed issues that won't otherwise be covered. The other person who I would point out are some of the more recent leaders of the task force. In particular, someone I spent a lot of time talking to, and that is Bode Chue. That person was very, very instrumental in the current task force. And I think it's good to mention one of those little tensions about what the task force should be. Some have argued that the personal finance focus that you talked about should not necessarily be the primary focus of the task force, but it's all about attracting young journalists to get into the field, to be reporters who focus on this area, but see business broadly beyond just the stock pages to the business in everyday news and feeling comfortable covering those stories. How do we get graduates who are finishing journalism programs to be equipped to take those kind of jobs and to advance in those opportunities that they may experience? So that is something I think the current leadership of the task force is really focusing more on. At the same time, you have those who started the task force who were also concerned about the personal finances of the members of NABJ who come to the conference, who come to the breakfasts like you're talking about, but also the financial state of the organization, which is a completely separate thing, but in some cases was of interest on the part of those in the business task force. Again, when you have an organization like NABJ with thousands of members, people come with different agendas. And so the question is, what are those subgroups supposed to do when the people change, when those who are leading decide to move off the scene and do other things? Well, that means the organization, the sub-organization being the task force, might shift a little bit. And, you know, a USA Today editor like Rodney, who was looking at all of these potential people out there who could be recruited away to their organization, now doesn't have the same impact that a local digital organization might have, or a person working in television who never worked at a newspaper but has developed a specialty in the area of covering stocks and bonds and other areas that are associated with business. It's having that broader focus and looking at how time changes is important to also tell the story of the task force.
Now, to make sure that this is not some theoretical or esoteric exercise, we have this phenomenon now called the Magnificent Seven. So everyone has their smartphones and other devices. So the most powerful companies are these seven companies: Facebook, Meta, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, and so on. The young adults, they have all these devices. They're tech savvy, but they need to follow the money. There's just ridiculous money going on here, and even with the things that entertain us, the streaming channels we watch and everything.
Yes.
When I read, I'm a Wall Street Journal subscriber.
Okay.
I say this is the biggest knife fight that's going on between Paramount and Disney and Netflix and so forth. And we should be in the game because we're not only we work in this field, but we're the consumers of all this content. So would
let me
George,
ask,
would you want to address that? I invite Dan to jump in if you have something to add.
Yeah, come on in, Dan. You got something to say? I don't know if, and I'm picking up my books because I have lots of them. I teach a media management class. And so in that media management class here at the University of Alabama, where I'm on the faculty, we're trying to acquaint students to the business side of media. And one of the things we're doing is unpacking the kinds of things you're talking about when it comes to consolidation. We spent a lot of time talking about television station groups, but now the Warner Brothers collection and who's going to be in charge, who's going to own that, in a few months, the regulatory changes that have to happen for those companies to get together. That's what we start talking about in that class, and we hope students will pick up on it. But when it comes to diversity of voices, when it comes to what role people of color have in those discussions, it all has to do with your involvement in those larger companies. First of all, knowledge that the companies are getting bigger and bigger. And you have the owner of the Weather Channel, Byron Allen, is probably the biggest player of color in that large media company space. Kathy Hughes and her son, Alfred Liggins, with Radio One, TV One, Media One. Those are two that I think of when it comes to African Americans who are in this particular discussion, but maybe not with those particular companies. So then it becomes a question of what role you'll have within those other companies that are not Black owned, but you could have a leadership role. And that is where we get the opportunity to diversify the people at the table, to ask questions about the content, to also look at the hiring practices.
Yes.
I can add that I teach a course called, used to teach a course called Survey of Mass Communications. And a lot of times I would just have a dialogue with these students about what kind of changes they see coming along. And one thing that struck me is that things are going to change because they have a whole different context than we have. We tend to think of the media in silos. There's print, there's broadcast, there's radio, but with them, it all comes out of their smartphones. So it's all one form of media. And I remember one class where I asked students to design a magazine, and it was so multimedia that I'm not sure what you'd call it. Was it a broadcast product? Was it a print product? But it had text content, it had music, it had photos, it had video, and it was just an idea. But I ended up thinking, wow, the future is going to look different once these folks get in charge.
Mm-hmm. It's funny that Dan, you mentioned that. I'm sorry. Can I jump in, Wayne?
Yes.
No, please go ahead. Now it's flowing.
I think it's important to reset when it comes to the people you're seeing tonight. So all three of us are academics, meaning we are teaching as one of our primary assignments every day. And we come out of the business, and my background is in television news. I started in Richmond, Virginia, my hometown, WTVR TV, the CBS affiliate. I produced newscasts there, even while I was working on the radio side, part-time at TV, full-time in radio, and that would have been in the mid-90s. I went over to Cincinnati, Ohio, spent 2 years there as a producer at the NBC affiliate, and then spent much of my career in Atlanta at the Gannett, at that time, Gannett Broadcasting, now Tegna-owned NBC affiliate, WXIA Television. And then I went to graduate school at the University of Georgia, and now I'm teaching full-time. But even here at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, we are part of the 45th largest designated market area, the Birmingham, Tuscaloosa, Anniston television market. So we have a full commercial television station producing 2 live newscasts a day, 7 days a week on the air with late news on weekends. But the students aren't watching television. They don't have a television. So if they're looking at a television story, it's content that is on their mobile device. So I had the news director from a television station in our class, but he had to remind them about, well, what is this over-the-air cast that comes on in our market at 5 o'clock and 9 o'clock? Because they're not accustomed to consuming news that way. Dan, that's what you're talking about.
Right.
That's an adjustment.
And you see that for us, that's appointment TV. We're the generation that would stop what we're doing and watch it at those times. But now every TV station that functions well has to have a great social media presence and also a great website, because they're doing stuff like the most important stuff, like, for instance, in the morning, is the traffic okay to get to work, or are there other things going on? So it's not a fixed 22-minute. Yeah, we do that fixed 22-minute newscast, but there are other ways to present the information 24/7 on television. It's not sitting down and watching the evening news anymore. That's for senior citizens to do, if they even do that. But no, I'm not. I kid you not, because it's a staple, but that's not how. Here's an example. Our son, who's working for local TV, he's in Atlanta now, but when he was working here in Hampton Roads area, he'd get up at 2 or 3 in the morning to go to work because he was putting out the morning newscast. And that's when the morning isn't happy news, just happy news anymore. It's the serious news. It's Europe is already well into their morning. He's editing video, so we're up to speed what's going on across continents. So yeah, everything is different. Here's another key thing. We're talking about specifically NABJ, and you talk about our business meetings. What happens with our finances is what's happening to the media industry. We know that it has been violently reconstructed. We were all working in newsroom positions. Now we teach it because things crashed in on us. But it's a different setup, and what was affecting us financially is affecting the very news organizations we used to work for. They have less people. They've lost most of their advertising. 75% of revenues, at least in the newspaper side, paid for the expenses, paid our salaries, for instance, and paid for everything else. And then 10 years ago, it dropped to 50%. It went from 75 to only 50%. And I heard that directly at Hampton University from our benefactor, the Scripps Foundation. And I believe it's less now. So, but there's still advertising. Where did it go? Advertising isn't something you read in a display ad in the newspaper or in a 30-second TV spot. But there are other ways that it's being presented on social media and such, and people have to know about that, because the economics, we have to be in this business game because the economics have changed. In fact, they're changing as we are talking to each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Wayne, just for the sake of our audience,
With that,
if you don't mind, can we get a little more information about where you work and your background? Wayne, you mentioned it, Hampton. Tell us what you do at Hampton, just so everybody knows, and then same with Dan.
Yeah. And I want you to do the same. So for me, I like to say 4 newspapers, 2 news services, 6 books before academia. So I worked at newspapers in Westchester, New York, and from there I stayed in Gannett Company and went to Cherry Hill, New Jersey, which is just 10 miles from Philadelphia. I spent 12 years there. I spent half of my career there. And then I went out to the Midwest for the first and only time and was an editor at a paper in Gary, Indiana, 45 minutes from Chicago. And then I came back east and I landed here in Virginia, where I've been for the last 28 years. I worked at a Chicago Tribune Company newspaper called the Daily Press and did that for 5 years. And then I exited, freelance for a while, and then I landed in academia. And that's what I've been doing for the last 21 years at 2 standalone HBCU journalism schools. So that's my story. So George, why don't you kind of give I guess you kind of described your background, but is there anything you want to add before we go to Dan?
The TV stations I mentioned earlier, and we should come back to that because that's really getting at the question you just asked. You talked about scripts, and that's where we're seeing some changes. But beyond that, I've been at the University of Alabama in the Department of Journalism and Creative Media since 2003. This is my 23rd year on the faculty. It's amazing how time flies. I came here because of WVUA television, one of now only 2 universities that own a commercial television station. And I wanted students to not only take the classes, but to get into a hands-on learning experience immediately. And so that was a motivation to come here. But since I've been here, I've also been able to get more connected to NABJ, most recently through the NABJ Academic Task Force. And that is where the impetus for our involvement in Black and Golden kind of started. So that's a quick overview on my journey. Dan?
Okay, Dan. Okay, Dan, why don't you first? We go back a long time, so why don't you give just your a timeline of your career?
Well, since I'm here to talk about politics, I wrote the chapter on politics. I'll tell my background from a political viewpoint. I majored in political science in college, and my first job out of college was as an aide to the late, great Daniel Patrick Moynihan, U.S. Senator from New York. I was low-level aide.
Wow. Did not know that about you.
Yeah, and I was the only Black person on his staff in any sort of position with legislative responsibilities. And this newspaper up, I believe it was in Albany, wrote a story about how he has no Blacks in positions of authority on his staff. And so they put the reporter in touch with me down in the basement part of the office, since I was the only Black staffer. And as I'm talking on the phone, other staffers were in the background saying, "No, don't say that. She's going crazy." And it was at that moment I realized, what? This politics is just a bunch of BS. I'd rather be on the reporter's side than on the political side, where I'd rather be on the reporter's side where I was just seeking the truth, and I didn't have to posture and talking points. And it took me a while to get into journalism, but I eventually did end up in journalism. And I've always sort of, as a journalist, either covered politics or actually came back into politics, which I'll talk about in a second. But I covered a lot of political campaigns. And when I was in Detroit, writing for the Detroit Free Press, there was a newspaper strike. It was very long and hostile newspaper strike, and I needed to pay the bills, so I needed a job. So I decided to go to Washington and apply for jobs as a press secretary. And I got hired as press secretary to Joseph B. Kennedy, who's now out of office, but yeah, one of the Kennedys. And I did that for about a year. Then I went to the re-election campaign of President Clinton. And I did that because I wanted to be forced to go back to journalism. I knew the campaign was going to end. And because I had met so many press secretaries who came over there to Capitol Hill for a temporary stint. I was still there 10 years later. And I didn't want to end up like that. So, and sure enough, I was forced back into journalism, and I worked first for weekly in the Washington area, and then I eventually ended up at the Raleigh News and Observer. So altogether, I worked for the Miami Herald, Detroit Free Press, Newark Star Ledger, Raleigh News and Observer, and we all know what was happening in the newspaper industry in the mid-2000s. And in 2008, I took a buyout from the News and Observer and eventually ended up on the faculty of St. Augustine's University in Raleigh, North Carolina. That's a HBCU, which unfortunately you may have heard about because it's fallen on hard times lately. But I love my teaching experience. I haven't worked there for about a year. Actually, by the time I left there, I was director of communications, but I was on the faculty for about 13 years. Okay. And I should also say that I covered a lot of political campaigns and political scandals and political this and political that. So I've always sort of had, interest in both areas, and I've been able to, fortunately, been able to satisfy those interests.
Could you, now, I remember when I met you, you worked at a local paper in New Jersey, but I was always intrigued by your time at the Miami Herald because it's it considers itself also the newspaper of the Americas. It covers the Caribbean, it covers Central America, and such, and of course South Florida is South Florida. Could you speak to, since you also in the chapter includes foreign correspondence, they have someone named Jackie Charles, who I referenced. Would you be able to say anything about people like Jackie Charles or even Howard French, who was a longtime foreign correspondent? He's now on the faculty at our graduate school. But could you say anything about those two as far as the kind of role they have? I mean, those two, or even a dear colleague of ours, Ann Simmons, who's a foreign correspondent.
All of whom I know. And it's interesting you should talk about Jackie Charles and Howard French because I know both of them, and you'd almost say they're polar opposites. Jackie Charles, she got into, she started as an intern at the Miami Herald at the age of 14. And when I was at the Miami Herald, I was there for 7 years, and Haiti was exploding. You had Papa Doc Duvalier violently repressing a popular uprising. You had corruption. You had practically civil war, and of course, the Miami Herald didn't have any Creole-speaking reporters. So if you speak Creole, and you could put a verb and a noun and a verb together, they needed you. And Jackie Charles has this Haitian background, and so she got into the Miami Herald. But this is the thing about Blacks' journey in journalism. Our journey in journalism is when we've been given the chance, we've excelled. And she was one of the Haitian journalists who excelled in that position. And the Miami Herald, I think their coverage of the situation in Haiti has been excellent, but they could not have done it without many of these Haitian-born journalists. I believe she was Haitian-born. And Howard French, I've also met. Now, Howard French is a brilliant guy. And of course, he was a foreign correspondent for the New York Times. He's written, I don't know how many books he's written, a lot. And well-educated, erudite. He's standard New York Times material. So, as blacks, as journalists trying to enter this field, we're not all cut from the same cloth. Some have come up with the School of Hard Knocks and can cover areas that white reporters just can't cover. They just don't have the context. They don't have the outlook. And then you have others like Howard French, who can stand toe to toe with any Harvard-trained reporter. And I attended Harvard myself, and I put Howard French against any of the people that I went to school with.
No question.
So yes, it's interesting that you mentioned those two, because they do represent sort of both aspects of our journey in this field.
And then there's Ann Simmons, the always cheerful Ann Simmons, but she is a Black Briton, so she still has that British accent, and she took it upon herself to learn Russian.
Right.
And he ended up being the Moscow bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal. And more than that, she's the person who hired Evan Gershkovich, the correspondent who was imprisoned in Russia on trumped up charges. And so she had a hand in working to get him released. And Gershkovich was released on the Friday of the NABJ convention in Chicago. I searched everywhere to make sure I had a paper that reported that monumental moment. So yeah, our members are not just cookie cutter professionals.
Right.
There are just plenty of surprises there. What would you say, bringing it closer to home, the Washington merry-go-round? In your chapter, Dan, you talked about some of these well-established Black journalists in Washington. In fact, the opening of your chapter talked about an extraordinary but not so extraordinary thing when it came to covering or moderating or interviewing at presidential debates.
Yeah, that was Lindsay Davis when she was a moderator of the debate between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. And when I did my research for this book, Black and Golden, I was surprised myself at how many Black journalists had been moderators of political debates. I knew of a handful, but they have had a history. But it's something that it's not something that I was personally involved in. So I can only imagine the kind of fight that they had to mount in order to get into those positions, because nothing is easy, nothing is handed to any journalist. I can attest to that. But the NABJ itself, the very first convention in 1976, they invited Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, the presidential candidates, and they both refused. And it wasn't until 1992 that Bill Clinton accepted an invitation to appear before the NABJ. And, Bill Clinton was sort of an early adopter, just like other candidates have been. Barack Obama was an early adopter to the influence of the internet. In 2024, Kamala Harris was an early adopter to the influence to the influence of influencers, TikTok and
Yeah.
podcasters. And so they've always been early adopters, but it took a while for candidates to realize the power and the influence of NABJ. And whenever they have done it, it's been to their benefit and I think to America's benefit too.
Okay. All right. One of the big issues is this anti-hostility toward DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Although I heard Gail King give an alternate acronym. She says for her, DEI means definitely earned it. But where do you see this going? Because it cuts across finance, but it also cuts across politics. Just what's going to happen, say, how this is going to affect the redistricting of congressional districts, these midterm congressional elections that are coming up. Would you like to address that in any way, Dan? Just maybe what you're seeing on the ground in the triangle, the Raleigh-Durham Chapel Hill triangle.
Well, that's interesting where that's going. It's an open question because in the 2023 decision of Students for Fair Admissions, I'm not sure I got the name right, versus Harvard versus UNC, University of North Carolina, the Supreme Court killed traditional DEI. It's over. You can't just have a race-based admission system anymore. It's strictly race-based admission system. It can still be a factor, but the traditional DEI was killed. But what's interesting is they didn't really say exactly what you could do. They said you couldn't use race as a proxy, although a lot of universities are doing something along those lines. Like they say you can talk about race in your essay, but how that's going to be used, well, we're not really sure. Of course, the Trump administration is monitoring very closely to make sure it's not. Essays aren't used as a proxy for race-based admissions. But see, here's the interesting thing. What the Trump administration wants is for political diversity to become important. Well, diversity is diversity. It's just instead of race-based diversity, you're doing political-based diversity. And how is that going to work? Because you can still get a progressive job candidate or a progressive student who can claim, well, you chose a less qualified candidate over me. Because how are you defining qualifications? When you say you can't take race as a factor, the assumption is that you're admitting a black student over better qualified white student. Although qualifications is something that can't necessarily be measured by SATs. So if you're going to say that political diversity is okay, but race-based diversity is not, well, aren't you now saying that you can have a lower SAT score and be hired because you're a conservative or be admitted because you're a conservative? So that has to be ironed out. And we don't know where that's going in terms of universities or corporate America, but I really think that has to be ironed out, because if you're going to say that political diversity is okay, well, then you're saying that there's not one standard metric that covers every candidate that we can use. And what is fair? What can you make an exception for? What can you say? Well, they don't have high, their SAT scores are not as high as other candidates, but they bring something to the table. If you can't say that on race, why can you say that on political viewpoint? So that has to be ironed out. And so I don't know where it's going, but I just talked with a friend about this the other day, and I said, I'm predicting there'll be a test case somewhere where a university hires a less qualified conservative candidate rather than a more qualified liberal candidate. It'll go to the Supreme Court. It'll be a 5-4 ruling because you can't justify political diversity if you're saying race-based diversity is unconstitutional. So we'll see.
Oh,
Wayne,
we'll see.
if
I
I
will
can
offer
jump in.
this. Oh, yeah, please.
Yeah, I think it's really important for us as NABJ members to broaden that conversation beyond just the political candidates and the people who are elected, even in North Carolina. We have to look at how the Supreme Court decision that Dan was referencing has been taken and applied by the current administration to impact policies, programs, practices at many of our institutions. Here in Tuscaloosa at the University of Alabama, we have a guidance document from the Attorney General that was the reason that 2 student magazines were shuttered just 3 months
Yes,
ago.
I remember.
And that is something
Yes.
we have to understand has not only impact on our university, but it was a national story. And it speaks to how we are interpreting those decisions when it comes to how we run our universities. That is, I think, a larger area of concern. The 2 magazines, one was oriented toward concerns of African American students, one oriented toward the concerns of women. And because of those target audiences, the university interpreted that as a potential violation. Keyword is potential violation of the direction from the Department of Justice. And so because you have that well-meaning action taken, you have an outlet for students of color and for women to get those messages out there that is no longer available. Both of those publications were open to any student to participate.
That's right.
But to err on the side of caution, I believe that those in decision-making capacities may have over-complied, all because of the guidance from the Department of Justice. And so that is something that we have to continue to monitor. I think that it has not impacted our enrollment, at least initially. We didn't have any students not return for the spring semester that I'm aware of. But that is one of those secondary effects, if you would, of a Supreme Court decision that was focused on college admissions, because there also are efforts at the state level and efforts in the Department of Education based on executive orders. This concern about DEI is much bigger than a Supreme Court decision. And that is something that I think we'll be seeing addressed in our upcoming regional conferences in 2026, and certainly in Atlanta in August.
Yes, and I want to give a real world example here at my campus. So my students, many of my students in the fall, and this was the fall of the 2024 election, applied for these high value internships, because often the best summer internships, you have to get the application in October or November. So they applied, and then the Trump administration comes in and they are openly hostile to the notion of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they send out these directives. So suddenly these students who would normally hear from these companies, media companies in the spring, they wasn't getting callbacks, and they're freaking out all around me. And I said, you know what? I think DEI is a fraction of what's going on. But I said, please don't panic, because I think what's also going on, and you alluded to that, George, is that these companies felt stuck. They were trying to figure out what to do. Are we going to get in trouble, get sanctioned, get harassed? And and plus they're trying to plan. I didn't sense any ill intent, and I just said, please be patient. But the story ended where most of these students, I'd say overwhelmingly, they got their internships anyway because the talent rose to the top. I mean, their talent. Because I already knew they were talented, the students I was dealing with. And I think it's flowing a little more. I've had some students last week stop me in the hallway and thank me for writing their recommendation because they've gotten into the top graduate schools of their choice, and other people are. So it hasn't, at least where I am, it hasn't dampened students' determination to apply for jobs, especially in mainstream media. I would also add that I'm at a certain age where, when we used to have this thing called affirmative action, a long time ago, President Reagan was hostile to the idea. However, corporate America was looking at the demographics, and they saw that 80% of the workforce were people of color and white women. And they said, well, this is what's coming in, and we have to hire the best and the brightest of them, despite how an administration feels. So,
hey, Wayne, I do want to bring in, this is the connection between my chapter and Dan's chapter.
yeah,
Understand those companies that you're speaking of. Well, many of them have business before the FCC or other parts of the federal government. And that is why many of them are concerned about their policies, because that could potentially thwart efforts to get bigger. And so on the business
right.
side of the business of journalism, we're covering these mergers. And let's return to a question that I'm not sure we really totally answered earlier, and that had to do with the companies that were consolidating and where diversity plays into that. Where does NABJ play into an effort by Nexstar Broadcast, Nexstar Media, to connect with a Tegna or a Scripps Television to connect with a Sinclair? When those companies are trying to get bigger and they have to have regulatory policies that are relaxed or changed, there has to be an approval that they get somewhere. And that approval will come from those who want to ensure that the DEI policies are not a part of the package. And so you have a very awkward position of some of those companies that, like Nexstar, like Scripps, who have promoted their diversity, but now having to kind of walk that back a little bit, or at least not emphasize it, because they're committed to diversity, but they don't want to keep that to keep a roll from them getting bigger. That's the little tension. And I think we have to put that on the table.
Yes. And I hope for the folks tuning in, you see that we all have to be engaged in this, because, like I say, this is metaphorically, this is a knife fight going on among these companies, and they're also trying to figure out what to do and what will keep them viable. And so we're all in this game. Yeah. So we are starting to wind down. Would you like to make closing arguments or closing statements on just where we seem to be going? As far as NABJ, we will be meeting next August in Atlanta. Atlanta is a mecca for us. Well, where do you think we're going in the next few months, or on the road to Atlanta?
Well, Wayne, I think it's really important to emphasize, and I made this point earlier, that NABJ is a lot more than our conference in August. And between now, February 15th, 2026, when this program is airing, and August of 2026, a whole lot can happen. But one of the key players in that activity is our task force, whether it's the business task force or the sports task force or the one that you and I are part of, and hopefully Dan at some point this year, the academic task force. We have an opportunity on a more regular basis to get our members together and to have an impact. And even if we don't come to the conference, we still are operating actively in NABJ. Our regional conferences will
That's
be
right.
happening this spring. And I know for our region in the Southeast, we'll be meeting in Alabama, in Montgomery, in April. And so that's an opportunity for us to talk about not only the federal efforts to thwart DEI, but here in our state, we have now in our second year of a divisive concepts legislation. What does that do to our efforts as journalists to tell stories that relate to issues of diversity, equity, inclusion? And that's just one topic. There are other issues that are also very important to the members of NABJ that we're able to address in our organization.
Can I stop you a moment?
Divisive concepts, yes.
Divisive concept.
Yeah, 129.
That sounds, is that like an attack on the First Amendment?
Well, that's a bill that was passed by the Alabama legislature and signed into law in 2024. And it went into effect in the fall of 2025 and fall of 2024, and is now more than a year old. And what that essentially says is you can teach on those concepts, but you have to be clear that you are not forcing assent, that your students don't have to agree with you on the topics like addressing slavery, addressing issues like critical race theory, addressing issues that have to do with gender and our friends in the transgender community. Those are issues that are considered divisive. So how we position ourselves as instructors in the teaching and learning environment is being closely watched.
And I think that as we discuss some of these First Amendment issues, we have to raise the banner of the First Amendment, because what we're seeing is the Trump administration attacking the First Amendment, attacking free speech, and that has to be our banner. And that's why it's so important for Black journalists to be in the decision-making process, because you can't control what people say, but I'm okay with that as long as there are diverse people making decisions about what we can say, about what we're saying. And so, I didn't even realize, George, thanks for pointing out that the American Society of Newspaper Editors, they no longer even measure diversity in newsrooms.
That's right.
That's distressing to hear. That just underscores the need for the National Association of Black Journalists to be in the mix, to be fighting for diversity, and just to make sure that that's the importance of that is something that is continually recognized by the government, by corporations, by the public at large.
Okay. Well, we've had a great time together. Thank you, George L. Daniels. Thank you, Dan Holly, for your insights about business reporting and political reporting and foreign correspondence. Next week, we will have Bonnie Newman Davis, who will talk with us about arts and entertainment reporting, and Hamil Harris, who will talk about sports journalism. So thanks, viewers and listeners, for tuning in to Black and Golden, 50 years of the National Association of Black Journalists, 1975 to 2025. The book Black and Golden is available on Amazon.com. It is also available at August Press, one word, augustpress.biz. Operators are standing by. It's a great book. I like to call it, it's a book within a book. The first third are the essays by our 9 great co-writers, and I write what is called the 21st Century Almanac. So this is the trilogy book to the original, the first book, which was the NABJ story, the second book, which was Rugged Waters, which covered the NABJ in the 90s and the start of this century. So we needed a 21st century book. So we have Black and Golden. Thank you, George, for the product placement. So see you next time. See you on Sunday the 22nd for Black and Golden. Good night.
Good night.